Welcome to No Apologies. I'm Dana Loesch. Just a little earlier, we heard from the Deputy Secretary of State and some of the DOD officials as well, Lloyd Austin, and of course, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, discussing the Taliban and also the security of the Kabul Air Force, or the airport. In fact, we've been hearing reports of Taliban that are not just blocking Americans, but maybe also Afghan assets that are wishing to leave the country, stopping them from even getting to the airport. So first up, this is Wendy Sherman from a little earlier today. Take a listen.
We have seen reports that the Taliban, contrary to their public statements and their commitments to our government, are blocking Afghans who wish to leave the country from reaching the airport. Our team in Doha and our military partners on the ground in Kabul are engaging directly with the Taliban to make clear that we expect them to allow all American citizens, all third country nationals, and all Afghans who wish to leave to do so safely and without harassment.
And later in the day, here was Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who was standing with Mark Milley, General Mark Milley, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, Austin looked absolutely stunned when a reporter asked him whether or not he's actually depending upon the Taliban to help evacuate Americans. Watch this.
And where do you take that? I mean, how far can you extend into Kabul? You know, and how long does it take to flow those forces in to be able to do that?
So it sounds like you're saying this depends on diplomacy with the Taliban. That's it. That's our only option, is getting them to agree to do this.
Well, let me add something here, Helene. Messages have gone out by various means of communication from the State Department to American citizens and others, and they're being told to go to those gates. For the American citizens, passport holders, the Taliban and the State Department are working out a I got it, but they're working out a facilitation measure. So those numbers are likely to grow. For the others, the State Department is still working through exactly getting the procedures for the evacuees to get to the airfield.
You're working on facilitation measures. Perhaps maybe if this had been planned better in the first place, if we had all of that paperwork, all of the facilitation and that process handled, if we had all the visas, including the SIVs, everything situated before making this big grand announcement on the world stage about closing Bagram Air Force Base, and then of course also then withdrawing the residual force from Kabul, maybe we wouldn't be in that position, General Milley. Now, General Milley addresses further what he's seen on the news about intelligence and the collapse of Afghanistan, particularly Kabul, that timeline. Listen to his take on this question.
Because I'm seeing all over the news that there are warnings of a rapid collapse. I have previously said from this podium and in sworn testimony before Congress that the intelligence clearly indicated multiple scenarios were possible. One of those was an outright Taliban takeover following a rapid collapse of the Afghan security forces and the government. Another was a civil war, and a third was a negotiated settlement. However, the time frame of a rapid collapse, that was widely estimated and ranged from weeks to months and even years following our departure. There was nothing that I or anyone else saw that indicated a collapse of this army and this government in 11 days.
Maybe that's because General Milley was too busy with his nose in his books of white rage and CRT. Apparently, they weren't paying any attention at all whatsoever to apps like WhatsApp, for instance, because they were too busy, the administration, monitoring wrongthink about COVID on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Now, that's the whole thing. WhatsApp, the Taliban, as they were rolling into Kabul, those 2 weeks leading up to it, Washington Free Beacon has a really good piece on this. Preston Byrne has been reporting on this. WhatsApp actually was used as basically a digital headquarters for the Taliban. In fact, Taliban were sending messages out to Afghans all through a number of these different provincial towns throughout the country. There were numbers that were given out for people who were with the Ghani regime if they even wanted to surrender to the Taliban. All of this was reported through WhatsApp between Taliban and Afghanistan citizens. Furthermore, we've known about WhatsApp being used for purposes like this as far back as 2019, when the New York Times ran a pretty in-depth piece on it and how really it seemed to be this, this blind spot in terms of intelligence along with the administration and along with American military. So was the military not even watching anything like this, knowing that Taliban had a history prior of using WhatsApp to communicate, and not just to communicate to residents, which is why, as reporters noted, reporters who were on the ground, by the way, in Kabul, that many residents weren't surprised when the Taliban just rolled in, because a lot of them had been notified through WhatsApp as to what was happening. But this whole idea of not even paying attention to these apps when we've been talking about domestic terrorism and monitoring Facebook and Twitter and everything else here in the United States is absolutely asinine. And as I said, when the Taliban has a history of using this prior, I mean, even back like several years before 2019. Oh my goodness, this is absolutely stunning. And I'm sure that you saw Lloyd Austin's his reaction to that question. And kudos to the press for asking, I can't believe I'm saying this, Ted, for actually doing their jobs. That's how it's supposed to be. A lot of failures. But you know the old saying, right? Success has so many fathers, but failure is an orphan. And obviously, the withdrawal of Afghanistan, this is a failure of the modern age, for sure. And this failure, most definitely, it does really feel kind of like an orphan, right? Nobody wants to own it, except everybody wants to pin it on Trump without recognizing the timeline of when Trump did what and when he actually ended any kind of negotiations. And by the way, that was back even before the Camp David meeting, when the Taliban had been accused, and when they when they admitted to carrying out a terror attack in Kabul that resulted in 11 fatalities, including 1 U.S. soldier. Even Joe Biden did everything that he could in his speech not to own his own disaster. He was the one who extended the timeline. He was the one who pushed it back to September for this bizarre 9/11 optic. But as this debacle unfolded over the weekend and the past few days, you might have noticed someone else who has not been present at all, so a pretty important figure. In fact, it's Vice President Kamala Harris. She's just been missing entirely. Vice President Harris hasn't come anywhere near this administration-defining moment. Why? That's kind of the question I want to explore in this segment. So where is the vice president? I mean, so far we have exactly 2 tweets from Vice President Kamala Harris regarding the catastrophe in Afghanistan. That's it. That's Vice President Harris's contribution to the dire situation. You remember, the last person in the room. Let's take a look at those tweets, in fact. Tweet number 1, this was on August 16th. And you can see it. Quote, "For 2 decades, our courageous service members put their lives on the line in Afghanistan. We will always be grateful and proud. Ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan is the right decision," end quote. So grateful and proud that they thought they would pull out in a manner that would just absolutely dishonor the work that so many have put into decentralizing the Taliban, to just kind of steamroll over the sacrifices that so many had made. Our soldiers that have sacrificed so much. Is that what she meant by that? But on to tweet number 2 from the vice president, which reads, quote, "We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago. Now our mission is to get our people, our allies, and our vulnerable Afghans to safety outside of the country," end quote. Did they do that? I mean, if they were so concerned about getting people to safety, probably leaving without a moment's notice or any, kind of advance warning was not the way to do it, right, Vice President? I just got to point out, too, imagine the tone deafness of tweeting about getting our people out of Afghanistan safely when we already know that an orderly and safe withdrawal is impossible at this point. But there's clearly not going to be a safe exit. But the vice president tweets about getting people out safely anyway. It's weird. We have images of people so desperate to get out of Afghanistan that they clung to the outside of U.S. military aircraft and fell to their deaths from the wheel wells. Exiting safely, that left the building a long time ago. But that's kind of typical of the last person in the room, super important but totally MIA vice president. There is a certain tone deafness and an awkwardness always on display from the way that she handles these situations, particularly when times are hard and questions tough. Now, this clip, this is from March. This is a great example. So do you remember how she laughed when she was asked about visiting the border as it devolved into a crisis? Watch.
Do you have plans to visit the border?
Not today, but I have before, and I'm sure I will again. Yeah.
Now, she went to El Paso where the wall was being built, where they actually don't have a record number of people crossing the border in that particular area because of, you know, the force multiplier, which is the wall. Whether it's that uncomfortable laugh the vice president always she resorts to every time she's asked about a tough question, something like the border crisis, or her just lack of likability, really. It's always kind of on display. It's when she dropped this line about being bused, that little girl was me. Do you remember this? This package line, and she actually said it throughout the campaign. This was during the Democrat primary, and she bashed Joe Biden, then candidate Joe Biden, over the head with it. And really, she was trying to make him look like a mean old white man. But I will say, not in defense of him, he was a big supporter of segregation. Let's flash back to the primary debates.
And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
She really, was really wanting to deliver that line. You know, they had workshopped it. They even had merch. They had merch. They had T-shirts that went on sale that night. I noted that on Twitter when it happened. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's mugs and shirts. And she did infer, and she was correct, actually. You won't hear me say that often. She inferred that Biden was a racist. Well, he was one of those big segregation supporters. You ought to go back and look at his quotes during that time. It's pretty shocking. Now, later she said she did it because it was, a debate. That's right. She had no problem casually inferring that he was a big giant racist during a debate because, that's politics. Maybe that explains some of the tension. I don't know. You hear rumblings of all kinds between their staff, especially these days. Well, that might have been her peak political moment because it's all been downhill from there. They made her a kind of like the border. They put her in charge of the border. But then she went down, she took some selfies with Beto there in El Paso, and then you haven't heard from her since. She's supposed to be going on this overseas tour to Southeast Asia, but we haven't heard anything from her on these huge issues, especially when her involvement was made out to be a very big deal. We could sit here and talk about the smoke weed and all of that other stuff. I really don't even care about what she did during the primary. But when she was AG in California, her and Biden actually weren't that far apart where it concerned crime, right? She imprisoned 1,500 people. The point is that she is an ineffective politician, a highly disliked one by her own party. In fact, during the primary, she received only 2% support from her own constituents. And it's one of the reasons why she was defeated so early on in the Democrat primary. She was unelectable. No way she was ever going to be elected outside of California. So she was relegated instead to playing wingman to another lackluster politician beyond his prime, Joe Biden. So she was placed in the role of VP because the establishment left. She's an Obama acolyte. They wanted her there, not because Democrat voters wanted her there. Nobody liked her. Her unfavorability was sky high. It still is. Too few of the base like her now. In fact, a whole bunch of wealthy women up in Northeast, up in the Tony Hamptons area, decided to get together and try to figure out how they could rescue her from her super high unfavorability ratings. A recent poll suggests that she's actually the most unpopular vice president in 50 years. So what does all of this have to do with her disappearance during this meltdown in Afghanistan? There's some things to suspect when you're that unpopular with the American people. For instance, maybe the last thing that you need is to have some of this fecal bomb known as this Afghanistan withdrawal blow up on your pantsuit. So she's gone missing, right? She's missing in action. Yet here's what Kamala Harris said about how she would always have Joe Biden's back, including on this very decision to to alter the withdrawal date from Afghanistan. Now, I want to point out here for a moment that Joe Biden had given a lot of interviews during the early days of this when they had first announced this September 9/11, when they first announced this optic, which we all thought was odd. And he made a big point. In fact, all these Democrats did that. Kamala Harris they needed to bolster up her foreign policy credentials, right? And so Joe Biden was telling Dana Bash with CNN this story as to how he was always the last person in the room whenever Barack Obama had to make an important decision, because that last person in the room, that's the person that you could count on. And so they made a big show about how Kamala Harris was the last person in the room, sticking it out with President Biden to the very end on this. Check out this interview.
President Biden always said that he wants you to be the last person in the room, particularly for big decisions, just as he was for President Obama. He just made a really big decision, Afghanistan.
Yes.
Were you the last person in the room?
Yes.
And you feel comfortable?
I do.
So where is she? The last one in the room is now nowhere near the room. No one can find the vice president, except on Twitter, tweeting about vaccinations, like we haven't heard that message a million times before. Meanwhile, virtually nothing about the very urgent meltdown in the Middle East. No remarks on that whatsoever. So from what we understand, there's been no emergency cabinet meetings. There's no call, they have not had any kind of calls with NATO. This is just kind of like the border crisis where, again, the vice president wasn't the last one in the room. It's like she never even entered the room to begin with. Just kind of like how is this quasi-border czar? She's hardly stepped foot on the border except for a photo op. Why? Maybe, perhaps, because she doesn't want any problem with the border crisis. She wasn't the one who actually had to finalize the policies, or she wasn't the one, maybe, making all the decisions in Afghanistan, so she wants some plausible deniability. It's a disaster. This administration is a disaster, and this is going to be the defining action of it. Now, according to a couple of different stories out there, there are multiple reports, Harris was asked to address the American people this past Sunday about the unraveling situation in Afghanistan, but she refused. Sources say that she blurted out, she was overheard screaming, quote, "They will not pin this redacted on me," end quote. Now that was quick. So from quote, "I'll be the last person in the room," to "they will not pin this bleep on me," end quote, right? So here's what the vice president wants you to know on her Twitter feed as of a couple of hours ago. That the coronavirus vaccines are safe, free, highly effective, but she retweeted this. They're highly effective vaccines, blah, 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 blah. CDC, yes, the CDC is announcing a new plan for booster shots. That's great. Can we talk about the thousands of Americans that have been abandoned in Kabul? So she'll be over there telling everyone to get vaccinated, and the president can handle the Afghanistan disaster. She was the last person in the room, and they really, really, really inflated her involvement in this, but she'll take vax detail. This is kind of all par for the course because the vice president is entirely tone deaf on this, and she doesn't seem to be particularly loyal. She never really did going into this partnership. But yes, there's one thing that you can say. Kamala Harris is very, very motivated by however she can advance herself, and it's very calculated. I mean, very much so. So whether it's her accusations of her behavior in California, climbing the political ladder, playing the victim card, social justice warrioring, very ambitious in the extreme. Kind of reminds me of Hillary Clinton in a way. Now, one very good reason that she might be staying away from all of this as far as possible is that she can't afford to own 1 inch of this Afghanistan disaster. I think she obviously has further political ambitions when Joe Biden's out of office. And not just because she's already terribly unpopular, but also because the presidency is suddenly looking very, very wobbly. Nobody can pretend at this point that Biden does not look lost and tired half the time. I am the furthest person away from conspiracy theories, and I do not entertain this stuff. I don't have, honestly, a lot of patience for anything that's not fact or that hasn't been vetted or really genuine, driven by curiosity, even some innocent speculation that's not just making statements and begging the question. But when leaders are this MIA, when leaders are this non-transparent, people are going to speculate. There were always rumors that whole old Joe from Scranton shtick, that was not only just a Trojan horse for a very unpopular socialist political agenda. There were a lot of people wondering if it was a way to cloak an agenda to install a very unpopular successor, the vice president. I mean, why else would the Democrat machine choose such an unlikable candidate to be VP and protect her, keep her away from everything, even when it was her responsibility, unless if they needed an insurance plan in case Biden was unable to fulfill his duties in the White House. Of course, this is all conjecture, but you do have to wonder. There's another reason why Vice President Harris won't go near this political IED called Afghanistan. If she were to one day be president, she needs to appear as the fixer in Afghanistan, right? She has to be looked at as the person with a solution. And so in other words, you can't be the fixer if the public sees you as the cause of the problem. So she needs to stay far away from Afghanistan and far away from that room she claims that she'll be the last one in, faithfully supporting her failing boss, President Biden. Because at some point, she may need to be positioned as the solution to all the problems that her boss caused. Now, again, this is complete speculation. But one thing to watch will be an interview that Biden's going to be doing with George Stephanopoulos on ABC. This is happening tomorrow, according to White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. Very interesting choice of interview. Now, George Stephanopoulos, he's a good interviewer. I know because I've done election coverage with him and I've also been interviewed by him in the wake of Parkland. But he's also, let's never forget, he was a Democrat operative. He shaped campaigns from the Clintons And then, of course, as many operatives do, they end up somehow as anchors and working in the news. But he's gotten critical interviews that helped Obama's core messages out during his administration's tenure. So it's going to be interesting to watch how this interview goes tomorrow. It'll be interesting to see whether or not Stephanopoulos gives a tough interview to Biden, kind of forcing him out, or whether he's going to approach him in kind of a rehabilitation way, right? Trying to salvage Biden's presidency, helping to spread the blame around, laying it all on Trump or the Afghan army, like Biden did during his speech just a couple of days ago. So again, I think that this interview is going to be worth watching just to see how it plays out, because it's going to be critical in defining the narrative around Afghanistan going forward for this administration. In any case, this foreign policy disaster is the kind of thing that destroys a presidency. And you can imagine that some of the Democrat leadership are wondering if Afghanistan is going to destroy this one. Now, if that were to happen, they would need to activate a highly unpopular VP to assume control of a sinking ship. Now, again, speculation, but if that were to happen at some point in the future, Vice President Kamala Harris, she might actually long for the days where she could hide out from all the storms, from all of the angles, only 7 months into this administration. Only tweets aren't going to be enough to deflect all the questions, and neither will her trying to laugh it off. If Kamala Harris were ever to one day assume the presidency, she would instead discover, just as Biden has in the last couple of days, that when you know what hits the fan, there's no leaving the room and there's nowhere to hide. So coming up, we've seen some of the legacy press actually act like legacy press when it comes to covering Afghanistan. Some, of course, predictably, are still trying to defend the Biden administration, and bizarrely, even the Taliban, if you've read WAPO earlier today. RedState's Jennifer Van Laar is holding the media accountable. She is our guest next. Stay with us. Black Rifle Coffee Company is a veteran-owned coffee company serving premium coffee to people who love America. Veteran CEO and founder Evan Hafer spent over 7 years on the ground overseas with U.S. Special Forces and as a CIA contractor. Black Rifle Coffee is committed to Evan's mission of supporting veteran, law enforcement, and first responder causes. So once again, as summer ends, should be over right now, right? Black Rifle Coffee Company invites you to enjoy your coffee, whether you're brewing the perfect cup of pour over or cracking open a can of 300 on whatever backcountry mission you can go on, because we've cracked open 1 million cans of 300. Black Rifle Coffee is here to fuel your way wherever this summer, if we still have it, takes you. So head on over to blackriflecoffee.com/DanaTV to order yours and use code DanaTV at checkout for 20% off your purchase and your first coffee club order. So fuel whatever is left of your summer with America's coffee. Black Rifle Coffee. We're in bizarro land. So for the first time in a long time, we've seen some of the legacy press actually act like legacy press. Like they're real reporters asking real questions when it comes to Afghanistan, doing real journalism, not journalism-ing. I don't even know how to behave right now. With the good, of course, there's always the bad and a lot of ugly still. But for instance, look no further than MSNBC. They legit invited on a Taliban spokesperson to join them on their broadcast to just spread propaganda about their organization as though it was a legitimate news item. And what's even more frightening is that, first off, the Taliban even has a setup like this that they can do these interviews, and also that they've taken more questions about this than Biden has himself. Wow. Let's get some perspective on all of this with Jennifer Van Laar. She is the managing editor at RedState.com. She's broken a ton of stories on California and Gavin Newsom, and a lot of people like to rip off her work without giving her credit, but not us. Jennifer, we appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
I've got to get your, first off, I got to get your reaction to everything that's the press conferences that we've seen just this afternoon. I actually stopped what I was doing, and when Lloyd Austin was being questioned, and he was asked, so are we actually relying on the Taliban? But I was stunned, not just because he was stunned, but because that was a serious question coming from a reporter. That's how starved we've been, Jennifer.
There have been some great questions over the last 2 days of Pentagon, State Department people, and I'm shocked but happy that they're actually asking them tough questions.
Yes, I mean, this is what we really do need to know. And whether it's been, are the Taliban actually are you relying on them actually to help get Americans out of Kabul and get these Afghan assets out of Kabul? If it wasn't for these reporters and even some on the ground, I mean, I got a Clarissa Ward with CNN standing in front of a bunch of Taliban, actually smack talking them. She wasn't in the area. She was there on the ground. Holly McKay as well. Is this, do you think, now this might be a rhetorical question, might be too optimistic, but do you think maybe we're going to see kind of a new real dedication to journalism in the press?
Oh, come on. You and I have been both around long enough to know that this is going to be a fleeting moment. But I'm glad that they are concerned about it now. And really, it's just, I think, selfish in a way about their questions. They have colleagues on the ground. If they didn't, I don't think they'd really be asking questions.
Yeah, and that's true. And I mean, there's so much still that we don't know. I think it's 3 or 4 times the press has attempted to get an answer from either Milley or Austin or even Sherman or really Jen Psaki, anybody, as to how many more Americans that are still over there in Kabul. And no answer yet, right? That I've heard.
I haven't heard an answer, and I wouldn't be surprised if they just really don't know. It seems like there's no organization in getting people out of there, whether Americans or other allied countries. So I wouldn't be surprised if they just don't know.
Yeah. And of course, with the good comes the bad, because there has been some bad behavior and still horrible reporting from some members of the media. I saw that you were talking about this too earlier today, that Washington Post piece where they were defending Twitter's decision to allow the Taliban to stay on Twitter because, as the Washington Post said, the Taliban plays by the rules, which I didn't realize that, beating a woman to death because she didn't have her face covered, that as long as they didn't do it on Twitter, that's following the rules.
Yeah, and they don't understand that they're using Twitter for propaganda and to coordinate. I mean, they wouldn't let Americans do that.
Right. And isn't that why Amazon Web Services dropped Parler, because of the accusation that they were somehow in part helping to organize January 6th? And of course, it turned out more people were using Facebook. So I'm flummoxed. I have more questions, so many more questions about the consistency of all of this. But it seems, Jennifer, that too few people in the media are interested in grilling people like Jack Dorsey on this.
Well, because they know that they'll get shut down if they do. So why would they bite the hand that feeds them?
It's a stunning development to see. This Trump derangement syndrome that's pushing some of these journalists to actually defend Taliban, I think it was predictable in some aspects, but to that turn, I've also seen some individuals who I thought have always been, there's too many to list, people that I always kind of wrote off as being, kind of super far left. I think that's kind of a measure as to how crazy it is, you have the Waffle House scoring for how bad a natural disaster is in certain areas. If the Waffle House is open, then it's okay. And so there's certain reporters and certain people in the media that I look at. If these people are mad, then this is beyond a disaster. It's kind of unscientific, but I think that's a fair measure. Jennifer, what's your take?
It's definitely a fair measure. When I saw Jake Tapper really getting mad the other day and questioning people and calling out Biden, then I thought, okay, this is bad.
Yeah, this is, I'm just stunned at all of this. And ultimately, it's going to be these people on the ground that are really giving us these reports. For instance, in this press conference, I noticed that Sherman and Austin and Milley actually were all nobody was on the same page. Because you had people saying, like Milley saying that the Taliban was, we were actually trying to, what was his phrase, deconflict? What is deconflict? I was surprised that wasn't a question. Deconflict and help Americans get out. And it was actually it was reporters that were almost in unison that were calling them out on, okay, which position is the official position? Do you think how are we going to actually be able to partner with them on this one instance to be able to get truth in this situation?
To partner with the legacy media on this, or the
yes. I know it sounds weird to say.
Yeah, we're going to have to, but I think that the big problem is there's no one upstairs in the White House or in Joe Biden's head. So there's no leadership. There is no coherent policy because there's no one making coherent policy.
Wow. I've been stunned by, who's the most impressive, last question for you, Jennifer, who's the most impressive reporter that you've seen so far the past 48 hours that's really, I think, that you think has worked the most, that surprised you in terms of grilling this administration on this?
Oh, I can't even name I can't name one because they've all surprised me. That a lot of them just really have stepped up. And it used to be just Ducey from Fox News was the only one asking the tough questions and getting singled out for it. And now they're all sounding like him, which it's good. But like you said before, it's not going to last.
I know. I'm telling people, don't get your hopes up. This isn't going to last forever. It would be great, but it's not going to. Jennifer Van Laar with RedState.com. Jennifer, thank you so much for your time. Good to see you.
Thank you.
All right, up next, we'll turn our attention to America's schools and catch up with someone putting legislation together to actually combat critical race theory. Former Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach is my guest on the other side. Stay with us. Every morning, The First publishes an email called Up First, where they curate the day's best news, the best videos, and the must-see moments that everybody's talking about. So if you're not getting this email, you're missing out. Go to thefirst.com to sign up today and to sign up for free. So welcome back to No Apologies. If there has been anything good that has come out of the past year in politics, it's the fact that parents and some politicians on the right are beginning to stand up to the woke indoctrination of kids. However, there are still plenty of woke educators out there, and some are even in your child's preschool. Watch this.
Story time. This has been my first year in preschool with a class of my own, teaching alongside another queer neurodivergent educator, and we have been rocking our twos class. We've been talking about gender and skin color and consent and empathy and our bodies and autonomy. It's been fabulous. But our teaching team is shifting and a new person is being onboarded, someone with many years of experience. So today at the lunch table, when the topic of gender and genitals came up, one of our students plainly looked up and said, "Well, I'm a girl today, but I know that teacher Co isn't. No, they're NB." And the look on the incoming teacher's face was priceless. She was shocked in a good way, and she just looked around at the two of us and said, "This class is incredible, and I am so impressed."
I need a glossary to understand what in the world she's talking about with this made-up gobbledygook language. Yes, that woman who was squealing in celebration of teaching, I mean, it's like bad Lewis Carroll, right? Is in charge of a preschool with preschool kids. So we need to continue to fight back against this kind of stuff. So one person doing just that is former Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, who is here with us now. Sir, thank you so much for your time. Good to have you with us. I think that is, if there is a silver lining, which is kind of difficult to say after the past year and a half of lockdowns, it's that parents really got an eyeful of exactly what their kids were learning, exactly what was in their curriculum, what their teachers were telling them. And now we're having this kind of tug of war over influence of our kids as everyone's going back to in-classroom learning. Talk a little bit about what you're doing in your efforts to stop this and give parents some more tools to push back against this.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. I'm working as general counsel of the Alliance for Free Citizens, and people can go to the website at allianceforfreecitizens.org. And what we're doing is drafting, and we have drafted, model state legislation, which anyone watching your show can download from the website and then email or call up or even send it to your state legislator. Because we've seen several school districts where parents have risen up and said, hey, this is nonsense. I don't want my kids taught this basically dressed up form of racism known as CRT, or don't want to be taught these wildly strange things like we just saw now about your kid can be whatever gender he or she wants to be today. So parents are trying to do something, and some have risen up at the school district level. But really, if we want to stop this in a much broader way, the appropriate place to do it is at the state legislature, because state legislatures in just about all 50 states have the authority to put some boundaries on curriculum. And so there is a bill that we have on our website, and people, as I say, people can download it about we call it the TRUE Act, TRUE, which is specific to critical race theory, which is another one of these outlandish ideas that these woke teachers are trying to force down the throats of our kids.
Yes, it's institutionalized Marxist racism with critical race theory. I'm hearing a little bit of myself in my ear, so apologies for that. But the CRT, it really is teaching division, and it's in a reimagination of American history with the 1619 Project, that the New York Times was promoting. It's not actually teaching kids, and this isn't real education. It's training for advocacy. I think that's probably a better way to put it, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's replacing history with ideologically charged leftist notions that are sprinkled into history inaccurately. And then the kids are taught you have to judge people by the color of their skin. And if someone's skin is white, that person is an oppressor. If someone's skin is not white, they are oppressed, and they should be treated differently. And people should be made to pay for the sins of other people of the same skin color 200 years ago. And other people should be rewarded. It's a ridiculous notion that is replacing actual history. I mean, before this crazy CRT thing started, our kids were already lamentably ignorant of our history because our public schools have been failing in that regard for decades. Now they're replacing what little history instruction is left with this garbage.
Yeah, of course, and it's, I mean, it's not, I can't even imagine how the academic measure of that, what that's going to look like, or really the emotional stability of kids who are kind of, I think it's like emotional abuse to teach students this. Did it shock you to see kind of the big tent of people who found common ground against this? Because I've heard from some Democrats, and I mean, obviously, you know, people who are conservative and Republican, but I've heard from Democrats and people who are just kind of independent. It feels as though the far left has no idea, or the left has no idea how to counter this because of that unity. It's so bad that parents everywhere are in opposition to it. Did that kind of surprise you, the way that there was no really counter to the pushback?
Well, you know, it sort of did at first, Dana, but then I thought about it some more and realized, you know, all of us, if we have children, we are parents first, and we are political activists or, you know, politically involved people second. You know, our kids are the most important thing. And so I think many, you know, Democrats, mainstream Democrats, are saying, look, I want my kids to learn history. I understand when they go to college, they may want to come up with some theories about what really happened or didn't happen in some period in history, but let's at least get the basics learned, and let's not try to manipulate my children by teaching things that just have nothing to do with the history that they should be learning. So I think you know, people are parents first, Democrats and Republicans second.
There you go, Chris Kobach. We appreciate your attention to this, and I'm sure that we're going to be seeing battles over the CRT stuff now that kids,
Yes.
because I'm seeing kids now recording their teachers in the classroom as they're going back to school, and they're hearing some of the stuff their teachers are telling them, and which is so smart for kids to do. So I'm sure that there's going to be a lot for parents to push back against, and a lot to grab your attention as well. Good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us and for all your efforts against this.
Great to be with you.
Of course. Coming up, folks, the cancel crowd is back, and they have demanded you can no longer talk about, get this, dumplings and noodles if you are not of Asian descent. I'm not exaggerating this in the slightest. We'll detail this insane story coming up. Well, it appears the soup Nazi's back. Do you remember the soup Nazi?
Very good, very good. You know something? No soup for you!
Only the soup Nazi of today is a culture writer and a wokester named Rosalind Talisan. See, Rosalind is really upset about one of the new sins of our racial age, super racialized. It's the sin of cultural appropriation, because nobody can differentiate between appreciation and appropriation, apparently, including people like Rosalind. So what is cultural appropriation? It's when someone borrows or celebrates something from another culture but isn't of that culture, which actually isn't appropriation at all. It's just stupid. Stupid that it's even labeled that. Many have been canceled or at least taken to task for committing the unpardonable sin of appreciating someone else's culture. For example, it might be calling your sports team the Indians when you're an American baseball team. Of course, no one is truly actually offended by cultural appropriation. No, you're not. But the point of accusing others of cultural appropriation is because they pretend to be offended for other people. They're so thirsty for offense. They try to actually take someone else's potential offense and put it on them, thereby making themselves look good because they care, right? They're super tuned in. The latest example of this backfired spectacularly, and I'm so glad that it did. Check this out. So some white lady who happens to make delicious noodles and dumplings wrote a cookbook about making delicious noodles and dumplings. And apparently that sin prompted this culture writer named Rosalind to attack her personally. Because after all, what does a white woman know about cooking and noodles, and that's like cultural appropriation because dumplings and noodles are a cultural item that only Asian people can make or write about. I know this doesn't seem like a real story, but I promise you, hands to sky, it is. So this is what a culture writer and a social justice warrior, Rosalind, had to say. She says, quote, "Why did a white woman write a cookbook about dumplings and noodles?" End quote. She had a lot more to say too, but that was like basically the gist of the tweet. Now I know what you're thinking. I know you're thinking that I didn't know that that wasn't allowed. Well, that's because of your internalized racism, you ignorant oppressor. I mean, do the work, like Robin DiAngelo says, to recognize your whiteness or whatever. And while you're at it, make sure that you don't have any noodles in your cupboards or Mexican food for that matter. And if you're not Mexican, you can't eat any Mexican food. Don't you dare enjoy a tortilla. Don't make one, don't write about it. At least that's according to culture writer Rosalind. Side note, these are the people that talk about inclusion and unity, which is so ironic. Because if it were up to these people, there would be absolutely nothing that any culture could share with another culture in America. We would have to just, like resegregate. So much for e pluribus unum, right? I mean, it seems that like the DEI and anti-racist folks, that's what they want, out of one, many, but they just want everyone to stop interacting with each other, right? This idea, by the way, that you can't enjoy something of another culture, if that's the take that Rosalind wants to have, okay, then don't drink pasteurized milk unless you're French. Don't wear gold hoops unless you're Sumerian. Don't use the internet unless you're British. Do we want to sit here and literally go down the whole thing? I mean, let's not even talk about tequila. Don't even talk about rum, right? Unless you are of the people who create this, you are of that ethnicity and ancestry, then you can't do any of that. Oh my gosh. Appreciating something is not cultural appropriation. It is appreciation. So I am not even getting into this particular woke performative game, right? I love enchiladas way too much, thank you. I love rum way too much, I mean, responsibly so. And I wear gold hoops like all the time because they go with everything. So, fight me. This was one cancellation attempt that didn't work out the way that the canceller expected. Oh my gosh, don't even get me started on sticky rice. I almost forgot that. See, the internet seemed to take real exception to culture writer Rosalind's attack on the white dumpling noodle cookbook lady, and thank heavens that they did. In fact, the tweet storm that came after Rosalind was so intense, she protected her tweets. So you can't see them anymore. But before Rosalind, fighter of cultural appropriation, could protect some of her tweets, the internet always is quick. They grabbed them, they screen grabbed them, and guess what? Rosalind, who tried to cancel a person over being white while cooking noodles, well, you'll never guess how she views herself after all this. Yes, she sees herself as the victim. It makes sense. I mean, here she was just trying to stop more cultural appropriation from happening, and now it seems like she's going to need therapy from all the mean tweets directed at her. So here's what this woke fighter against Asian noodle making by white ladies has to say. She says, quote, "Anyway, therapy cost me $130 a session, and I'm going to need it after almost 48 hours of harassment from Nazis. Thank you to everyone who sees what's happening. Tips in solidarity, heart emojis appreciated." End quote. Rosalind Towson, the culture writer, the social justice fighter against the cultural appropriation of noodles by white ladies, she then links to a PayPal where you can help this grifter and you can support her. Maybe you could help get her some coloring books or some pet therapy after all the harassment she's had to go through, except don't suggest anything to her that isn't of her ancestry or ethnicity, because you have to stay, I guess, in your own boundaries for whatever that means. Fate is real, you know what, sometimes? Really is. Hopefully Rosalind won't stress eat a pizza after this, because pizzas are Italian, and Rosalind does not seem to be Italian, and that could be cultural appropriation. I might be joking. Maybe I'm not. But anyway, for Rosalind Towson, here's to hoping that the world continues to reject your cultural segregation as bigoted point of view, because this is one white lady who likes noodles and dumplings way too much to give them up, right? In fact, I think I'm going to have those in sticky rice for dinner. Mango sticky rice. Oh, so good. Thanks for the suggestion. That does it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, and don't bend the knee.